Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we examine the global impact of last week's U.S. election results with Donald Trump re-elected as president. To shed light on the implications for international relations, economic stability, and American influence, I'm joined by Jussi Hanhimäki, Professor of International History and Politics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. In this conversation, Professor Hanhimäki explores how this election may shape the United States' role in the world, its alliances, foreign policy direction, and influence over global markets. We discuss the challenges and opportunities the U.S. faces in a rapidly changing global landscape, as well as how American leadership affects both allies and adversaries. The goal of this episode is to provide a deeper understanding of what this new administration means for global stability, diplomatic relations, and the interconnected nature of domestic and foreign policy. Jussi, great to have you back on What Matters Today. Let's just get into that first question right away about the U.S. elections. So, how do you see the role of the U.S. president shaping global stability today? And does the influence of the U.S. presidency still hold as much sway globally as it once did? Or have other powers and institutions begun to balance that influence?
So the U.S. president still is the president and the executive leader of the most powerful country in the world. So that certainly has as a consequence, yes, the president does have a lot of influence a lot of global influence in terms of whether it's towards global stability or instability in some cases.
Right.
So there is a lot of impact that decisions made by the American president are going to have in different parts of the world, depending, of course, on the kind of decisions are made. However, I think if we compare some of the situation today in 2024 to, say, some 20, 30 years earlier, or certainly in the period of the Cold War, then I think the United States has clearly lost some of its, what we call soft power, influence that it yields on a sort of moral as well as economic and military basis. We rarely today really talk about the so-called free world that once was a reference point for everything, and as a consequence, the US president was the leader of the free world. But today it seems that term has gone out of fashion. And in part, I think it is indeed thanks to the changing political dialogue, debate, and the so-called Trump era, which now is 8 years old and is going to go on for some time. So one could say the past decade has been sort of the Trump era, and an era which is not only Trump, but of course the sort of ongoing struggle between various populist parties all across the world, but certainly in Europe and so forth. And then those who believe in the values of globalization, of multilateralism, international institutions. And so that's the sort of dichotomy, or that's the sort of a binary situation that we find existing in many, many countries, and not just the United States.
And now let's talk about Trump specifically. What specific areas of American foreign policy are most likely to change or remain consistent with this new Trump administration? Are there any particular regions or alliances that could see shifts, such as NATO, Asia-Pacific relations, or Middle East policy?
I think you're going to see some shift in all of those areas in terms of, if you go in the order of what you mentioned, NATO and Europe, and of course is connected to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And I think there Trump has promised in the campaign that he's going to end the conflict in 24 hours.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, when the 24 hours starts, we don't know. But at some point that will come, and there'll be an end to that conflict. Now, that probably would have happened, was going to happen in the next 6-12 months. I think the direction of travel, so to speak, was clearly that there was fatigue among the supporters of Ukraine growing. Mm-hmm. There was the likelihood of Ukraine being liberated militarily has become quite extinct, it seems, at least for the moment. And that combination clearly has increased some pressure to try and begin finding some form of a diplomatic solution to the conflict. I think with Trump, that search for a solution is going to go on sort of fast track situation, and whether it will even happen before he officially takes office in January is, I mean, that's entirely possible. But no matter when and how it happens, Trump will somehow find a way of claiming credit for this. The other big question, of course, that people ask about NATO is the idea that Trump has propagated many times, and in his first administration, NATO is obsolete. We don't want to, keep supporting these free riders in Europe.
That's right. Yeah.
And so forth. Is that going to now also go on sort of fast track and lead perhaps to the United States distancing itself from NATO, perhaps even leaving NATO altogether? Anything is in theory possible. The US can give 1 year notice and leave. That's possible. I think that's very unlikely, in part because leaving an old institution like NATO means actually that you're going to lose a lot of influence in the process. And so is that something that a strong leader like Trump sees himself as wanting to do? I doubt that's really going to be the case. But you're going to see, I think, probably two things. And, this is all guesswork in a sense, that one of the big things about Donald Trump is that he likes to be unpredictable. He likes to do things we don't expect. He likes to say things that nobody expects, and then we all, retreat in shock. And then most of the time, these sort of threats and statements don't really have serious follow-up, but sometimes they certainly do, and that's sort of the point. So in one scenario, it's possible that the peace in Ukraine will come through some kind of a NATO membership or NATO guarantee for Ukraine, what is left of Ukraine for its security, in which the United States will play a role, and that will be the price of a peace and that Donald Trump and the United States will accept that. And that's one possible, but that means NATO will continue its existence. I think the other thing that's almost certain to happen is that Trump will continue to say, well, NATO countries, most of you are now at 2% defense spending. Let's go for 3% or, otherwise, whatever. And, it's a game, and it's very sort of Trumpist in a sense that this is very transactional. You show me something and then we can talk. I'll give you continued support if you, buy our fighter jets and so forth. Which is my country, Finland. That's actually one of the deals Finland did last year. Is to buy this whole set of fighter jets and so forth. So, I mean, NATO is not just, in other words, just about Article 5, and that it's also about all it's a big business, NATO. The military sales, the United States is the world's largest military producer of hardware and so forth. So NATO is one of its biggest customers. So it's, there are some commercial incentives in staying in NATO that I'm sure won't be totally ignored by the Trump administration. Last point, just to add that, if past is any guidance, then in the first Trump term, there's a lot of talk about United States leaving NATO. In fact, the United States stayed in NATO and 2 countries joined NATO during his first presidency. And same was true with, 2 other countries joined during the Biden administration. So the record seems to indicate that there's not going to be an immediate withdrawal or anything like that, but there's going to be ongoing pressure and aiming to gain something of the leverage that the United States continues to have vis-a-vis Europe, which is protection.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what about the Middle East? Because today in an event you mentioned Netanyahu was quite pleased with the results. Can you maybe expand a bit on that?
So the Israeli Prime Minister clearly was very pleased about the outcome of the election and thinks that Trump is his special friend in the White House. And I think it's clear that Trump will certainly continue to support Israel. And we see in the first term, again, if you go back to Trump's first term, of course, he took a very clear-cut pro-Israeli stance in moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem and so forth. So there wouldn't be any surprise in that sense. I think at the same time, the goal of the Trump administration will be to also end the conflict ongoing conflict in the Middle East. And so that will mean that there will be also that Israel will not have a free hand to do whatever it wants. There will be some pressure put on Israel and to enter into negotiations and to indeed leave Gaza and so forth. Again, it's also likely that some of this will take place. The US system is so bizarre that now we have 2 months before Trump actually is the president. Yeah. And so a lot of things can happen before that, and something in the Middle East is very likely to happen before he becomes president in anticipation of his arrival. So we will certainly see some of that. Now, I would add that, again, like in Ukraine, if Kamala Harris had won, there would be equal pressure to go to negotiate and come up with some kind of an agreement. I think it would have been slightly less pro-Israel in some ways, but again, the United States was never going to abandon Israel in this context. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And how might the U.S. election results affect the current global economic order, especially concerning trade and relations with China and the European Union? Could we see new economic policies that affect global markets, supply chains, and international trade agreements?
So I think overall, the Trump administration is probably going to overlook, as the first Trump administration did, the WTO, which will have some impact here in Geneva, of course, because here we are by the lake, right? So it will, there will perhaps, maybe there'll be a similar sort of empty chair kind of policy as there was during the first Trump administration. Perhaps in the extreme, the United States will leave. And then, of course, if that happens, that will certainly create a major impact on global markets and on the idea of free trade in general. So that's one thing. Trump said in the campaign, the most beautiful word in the English language is tariffs. I think he believes in the power of using tariffs either as a threat to get gains and to sort of get other countries to act in a certain way. And I think that's mostly what he's thinking of. But there is the likelihood that in order to, you can't just talk it up. You also have to make some examples. You have to enact a few tariffs. And I think, domestically, politically speaking, China is an easy target. I mean, it's what you call low-hanging fruit, that, you can attack China as much as you like and nobody's going to complain about that until one fine day, they realize that perhaps the outcome of high tariffs on China is high prices in the United States. And then that will sort of change the calculus. So I think in the Trump administration, the challenge will be to find a way in which you can, claim and enact tariff policy on China and also perhaps on the EU that will have the sort of politically be popular in the United States, but have the minimum economic impact, negative impact on the United States. Because one of the big things, one of the challenges for the US, one of the main reasons why Trump won was the high prices in the United States. Yeah. And so if those high prices start going up, it's not going to be a very happy situation for the Trump administration.
Definitely not. And in your view, what impact does American domestic policy have on the rest of the world? With many countries watching U.S. policies on issues like climate change, technology regulation, and immigration, could these areas influence similar policies globally?
Certainly. I mean, I don't think the United States is a similar sort of trendsetter as perhaps it once was. As the first question you asked me related to that, but it is the biggest player on the global marketplace and so forth. Trump is probably the best known individual in the world at the moment, and so this victory, this political event in the United States and its outcome is watched very, very closely throughout the world. It's likely to embolden, the little Trumps around the world, or the sort of copycats, whether in Europe or elsewhere. We have in Brazil Bolsonaro, who's, thinking about running again and being the Trump of the tropics again one more time. Has similar histories in terms of trouble with the law and what have you. So that's possible. We have a number of countries in Europe where populism, nationalism, so forth have been a phenomenon now for over a decade, a significant political phenomenon. Who knows Germany is likely to have new elections. We'll have elections, I think, because now we have a minority government that can't last.
Right.
So probably next year we'll have elections in Germany. Last elections in Germany saw the sort of gradual rise of the far right. Is that going to continue in that context, very possible. And so the list is sort of endless. We have, of course, in Italy, what we used to call a far-right leader, but has sort of become more moderate ones in government, Prime Minister Meloni, and so we have all of these people. We have in France, of course, Marine Le Pen waiting in the wings for the next presidential election. So yes, so we have clearly US policies and politics will have an impact and lead to all kinds of calculations in this regard. They will also, depending on what the Trump administration does, the Paris agreements, I'm going to see a second withdrawal from there. How will that play in terms of certain countries that perhaps are having similar political debates about whether or not climate change is a real thing, with something that we should sacrifice economically to help out and so forth. So yes, you're going to see all of that happening. Immigration is a big issue in Europe, as in the United States. And so, in fact, because we have similar issues, similar challenges in Europe and North America, the politics align themselves quite neatly as for an observer to look at. You have, immigrants coming across the Mediterranean. You have immigrants crossing from Mexico into the United States. It's not entirely, so you can see that politics would address those types of challenges. And with Trump's current success in political success, that will certainly raise issues. So I think the answer to that might be that and this is what I think what you're going to see. One thing to remember, the domestic politics in the United States always been very divisive. They've always been very sort of binary. It's win or lose. There was one thing to underline about this election is this was not a landslide.
Right. Yeah.
It was a victory. It was a decisive victory because you could color the map mostly red as a consequence. But the margins of that victory were very, very small. And it says that there's about 40,000 votes that in a few districts in those so-called swing states that's really made the difference this time around. But it could have gone the other way. So it's not a slam dunk, even though it's of course been presented that way in many media outlets. And that again, I think that is what in some ways symbolizes a lot of the situations in many European countries that yes, there is a strong sort of nationalist, populist element in the current body politic, but it's really half or more than half of the electorate. In most European countries, it's always a minority.
Right.
In most European countries, it's impossible to govern without having a coalition of some sort. And that, I think, the political processes or the systems therefore differ a bit from the United States, and the sort of drastic moves to the right or the left are much more unlikely than they would be in the United States.
I like the term little Trumps. Related to that, how do you think Trump's relationships with leaders like Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Viktor Orban have impacted U.S. foreign policy? And these relationships were and still are quite controversial. Do you think certain elements of those diplomatic approaches will continue in his second term?
Short answer is yes. I think Trump believes in the power of sort of personal relationships and personal diplomacy. And he very much, I guess, like many of his predecessors, in fact, thinks of himself as the first diplomat of the United States, as his own Secretary of State, in fact. That, and if you think about the last 50 or so years in U.S. history, the Secretary of States often are sort of figures that melt into the background. Unless there's some reason why we pay attention to them in the case of Hillary Clinton or someone like that. But for the most part, presidents like to run their foreign policy because that's where the executive has the broadest leeway in many ways. And so in order to run that, and I think Trump, as many of his predecessors, is going to rely on these one-on-one meetings with leaders, whether friendly or unfriendly, whether allies or adversaries. But it's in those situations that I think the belief is, the Trump's belief is that he can talk to Putin, he can talk to Kim Jong-un, he can talk to Viktor Orban, he can talk to all of these guys, and he can practice the art of the deal, as he claims so successfully does always, and make a good deal for the American people. I mean, that's the sort of the basic line of argument, I think. And how successful is that going to be? I'm not, it's a mixed success if you go back to his first term. That, of course, North Korea, yes, there were a couple of meetings, but then it all fizzled off. Vladimir Putin clearly did not there was no war, but was there going to be a war without Trump? It's impossible to prove, and so forth. So he has a certain, it's very, very difficult to see how certainly the foreign policy cannot rely simply and purely on these personal relationships, but they're going to be, I think, front and center when Trump takes office. Whenever he's gonna meet the foreign leader, he's going to practice the art of the deal.
I think that's the perfect way to end this episode. So, Jussi, thank you very much for joining us on What Matters Today.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
That was Jussi Hanhimäki discussing the impacts of the US election results. This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.